All right, everyone. Welcome to Right to the Top. In today's video, I'd like to examine more closely a very common writing tool. We're going to explore words that are used to show contrast between ideas, clauses, and so on. This might be a bit confusing for some of you, but we'll be taking a closer look at words like but, however, and nevertheless to understand the differences between them, okay? So I refer to these as writing tools for showing contrast, but naturally, we can also use them in speech. It's less common to use nevertheless in spoken English, but it's certainly possible. The first thing we're going to examine, and the initial grouping, is grammatical functions. So, before anything else, before we delve into meanings or context, we need to understand how to use these words correctly. Now, each of these words belongs to a specific part of speech. I'll go over some specifics in a moment. So, let's start with but and yet. What these two words do is join two independent clauses into one compound sentence, okay? Two independent. Though, although, and even though are also conjunctions, but they are classified as subordinating conjunctions, which means they connect an independent clause to a dependent clause. The conjunction is paired with the dependent clause, which in this case is an adverb clause, to indicate contrast. They can be used in this manner, and once again, you have the flexibility to rearrange clauses, but that's a completely different topic. Now, words like however, yet, and nevertheless tend to cause the most confusion and lead to the most mistakes. Essentially, however and but share the same meaning, with however simply being a more formal alternative to but. The meaning, function, and purpose within a sentence are identical. However, it's important to note that however is an adverb, not a conjunction, which means it cannot be used to connect two clauses. While it can link ideas as a transitional word, it does not serve to join independent clauses within a sentence. I'll provide some examples to clarify how to use it correctly. Sometimes people wonder about the difference between however and nevertheless. I've come across many online responses claiming that nevertheless is more formal than however. However, this isn't accurate. Both words are formal, but nevertheless is used less often in writing, which leads some to mistakenly believe it's more formal. What I'll demonstrate today is that there's a subtle distinction in how we use however and nevertheless when contrasting ideas within a sentence, and how their usage differs from words like but or yet, among others. So keep in mind that these are adverbs, which means they require proper punctuation and positioning within a clause or sentence. Unlike conjunctions, they can be moved to different parts of a clause. Finally, we have despite and in spite of. These two expressions are identical in meaning. My only advice is to avoid mixing them up. Don't say despite of or in despite, for example. Otherwise, their meanings are the same, and both function as prepositions. Since they are prepositions, they form part of a phrase rather than a clause, and are typically followed by a noun, gerund, or gerund phrase as the object of the preposition. I'll also provide examples to illustrate this. So, keep in mind that these are adverbs, which means they require proper punctuation and positioning within a clause or sentence. Unlike conjunctions, they can be moved to different parts of a clause. Finally, we have despite and in spite of. These two expressions are identical in meaning. My only advice is to avoid mixing them up. Don't say despite of or in despite, for example. Otherwise, their meanings are the same, and both function as prepositions. Since they are prepositions, they form part of a phrase rather than a clause, and are typically followed by a noun, gerund, or gerund phrase as the object of the preposition. I'll also provide examples to illustrate this. So, that's our first category, grammar. You need to use these words correctly before focusing on anything else. It's important to note that but and however can have other meanings beyond their role as contrast tools. For instance, but can function as a preposition meaning except, as in, the restaurant serves all dishes but the seafood platter tonight, which translates to all dishes except for, or simply not including the seafood platter. Similarly, however can be used as a subordinating conjunction, though in this context it doesn't express contrast. Instead, it means anyway that, or no matter how. For example, imagine I'm a teacher trying to explain a difficult concept to my students. In this case, however I present the material, some students may still struggle to grasp it, meaning no matter what approach I take or how clearly I explain things, their understanding might not improve. So, it doesn't really matter. Just to clarify, we're not diving into these alternative uses today, but I wanted to mention them because they're interesting points to keep in mind. Here are some examples, and for now, we'll concentrate solely on the grammar. Research shows that people who exercise regularly feel healthier, but those who don't often report feeling sluggish. In this case, I'm using the conjunction but. Notice there's no comma, though I could include one if I wanted to. It's not necessary here since the sentence is short and the contrast is clear and direct. You can choose to add a comma or leave it out. It's up to you. By the way, I've made a couple of videos about commas, which you can find linked above. All we're doing here is highlighting a difference. The survey results reveal two contrasting trends. First, that people in urban areas save less money, yet those in rural areas tend to spend less. When using yet, a comma is necessary. At this point, we're beginning to notice a subtle distinction. However, for now, I'm simply focusing on showing the contrast. With yet, I'm starting to subtly emphasize the idea that urban dwellers save less, which sets up an expectation. But I won't delve deeper into that just yet. It's coming up soon. One more thing I'd like to demonstrate is that you can use but to start a sentence. You can place a period, capitalize the B, and follow it with a comma after but. For example, reports indicate that people in cities save less money, but individuals in smaller towns are more frugal. Notice how I emphasized the word but, paused briefly, and then continued with the contrasting idea. In this usage, but carries a similar meaning or nuance as yet. I'll clarify this distinction shortly. And yes, it's perfectly fine to begin a sentence with a conjunction like and or but. While it's not very formal, so it's best avoided in exams like the IELTS or TOEFL, or in formal academic writing, it is technically grammatically correct. Next, surveys show that people in metropolitan areas save less money. Notice the use of a semicolon, followed by a lowercase h and a comma. However, residents of rural regions manage their finances more carefully. In this case, however, has the same meaning and function as but, whether it's used with or without a comma. I can also replace the semicolon with a period and capitalize the h, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. Additionally, I can place however in different positions within the sentence, including adding li to it, which I'll explain shortly. The same rules apply to nevertheless. Nevertheless, I've used a semicolon, followed by a lowercase n, and then a comma before continuing. With however and nevertheless, you might notice a slight, very subtle shift in tone or connotation between the two sentences. I'll explain that shortly. Reports indicate that although city dwellers save less money, rural residents are more cautious spenders. Alternatively, reports indicate that city dwellers save less money, although rural residents are more cautious spenders. You can place the conjunction with either clause to subordinate it, depending on which idea you want to emphasize more. This concept is fairly straightforward, I believe. Surveys show that despite city dwellers saving less money, rural residents are more financially prudent. Here, notice that I've used the gerund, saving, as the object of the preposition. I could also phrase it differently. Surveys show that rural residents are more financially prudent, despite city dwellers saving less money. The order can be rearranged. It's not crucial as long as the main idea is clear and you emphasize the right information. We'll discuss this emphasis in more detail shortly. Just a couple of additional points. Let me quickly clear all of these examples. Okay, so again, you can use a period and start a brand new sentence with a capital H, or do the same with nevertheless. These words can also be moved around within the sentence because they're adverbs, meaning they can occupy different positions in the clause. For example, Surveys show that city dwellers save less money. Rural residents, however, are more careful with their spending. Here, you'll notice commas before and after, however, as it's functioning similarly to but. On the other hand, if you look at nevertheless in the example below, there are no commas. Why? Because in this case, nevertheless serves a slightly different purpose. It emphasizes something. Specifically, it highlights the fact that rural residents are more cautious. In this instance, nevertheless is acting as an adverb modifying the verb, which is why no commas are needed. However, when however appears between two commas, it's contrasting the entire clause with the previous sentence, which is why it's set off by punctuation. Generally speaking, nevertheless tends to modify a verb, just like a typical adverb would, and we'll discuss that in more detail shortly. So there you have it. That's the grammatical aspect of these words that you need to remember. Now, we're going to move on to something a bit more complex, but don't worry, I'll provide plenty of examples to make it clearer. Hopefully, I succeed. I've tried to organize this into a kind of diagram as best as I could. Here's what you need to keep in mind about the different groupings of these words. First, we have one group, but, however, though, and although. These words all function in essentially the same way. Then there's another group, nevertheless, yet, even though, despite, and in spite of. This second group has a slightly different connotation and is used differently depending on the context. When using balanced contrast with words like but or however, I'm presenting two pieces of information that are related but different. I'm not emphasizing one over the other. Both are equally important. Typically, the second piece of information will naturally lead into my next sentence and help the thought progress. For example, the team won the championship, but they struggled financially. They won the championship. That's a fact. However, they also faced significant financial challenges. These are contrasting ideas, which is why but is used. Remember, when showing contrast, you're highlighting an opposing, negative, or positive relationship, or simply pointing out a difference. For instance, she enjoys cooking, but she dislikes baking, opposite preferences. Or, I plan to travel, but I ended up staying home, positive intention versus negative outcome. It could also be a neutral difference like, last year we celebrated indoors, but this year we celebrated outdoors. Or, in this culture, people greet with a handshake, but in that culture, they bow. The key is that you're showing the differences without prioritizing one idea over the other. That's what balanced contrast is about, and those are the words you'll use for it. Next, we move on to emphatic contrast. Here, I want to emphasize one part of the comparison more than the other, or, to phrase it more accurately, I want to highlight one part to give the other part greater significance and make it more meaningful. Typically, you'll emphasize the first piece of information by using one of these contrasting words, such as nevertheless or yet in the second part. What you're doing with these words is setting up an expectation. You present a piece of information that leads the reader to anticipate a certain result or continuation in the second part. However, when they reach that second part, it completely defies their expectations. This creates a sense of surprise for the reader because the expected outcome and the actual reality are vastly different. The result is a stark, dramatic contrast rather than a balanced one. The company is highly profitable. However, as soon as I see the word nevertheless, I immediately realize that my expectation won't be fulfilled. If the company is profitable, I assume its employees are well compensated. Nevertheless, while it's true that the company is profitable, this fact is acknowledged and accepted. It doesn't change the reality that the employees are underpaid. So, the emphasis here is on the contrast. Now, I'll provide more examples to hopefully clarify this further. All right, let's start with a couple of simple examples to get us going. It's raining outside, yet the ground is dry. First, let me give you a bit of context. I'm saying this in a desert region. In deserts, it's common for rain to evaporate quickly due to the heat, so the ground often remains dry even during a downpour. If you visit a desert during the rainy season, you might see rain falling from the sky. yet the sand beneath your feet stays bone dry. So when you say it's raining, no one really expects the ground to be wet because everyone knows how arid the environment is. Here, I've simply used yet to show contrast. Rain, yet dryness. The difference lies in what we see versus what we expect. If I say, it is raining outside, nevertheless the ground is dry, it feels a bit unnecessary, doesn't it? The word nevertheless seems overworked here because no one expects the ground to be wet in a desert anyway. However, if I say this sentence in a tropical rainforest, it is raining, nevertheless the ground is dry, or nevertheless the ground is dry, it actually makes sense. Why? Because it's the complete opposite of what you'd expect on a rainy day in a rainforest. On a rainy day in a rainforest, you anticipate saturated soil, not dryness. So, in this context, nevertheless works effectively. In a desert, it feels out of place, but in a rainforest, it fits perfectly to highlight the unexpected contrast. This demonstrates the difference between balanced contrast and emphasized contrast. Hopefully, this example clarifies things a bit more. Maria loves chocolate, but she avoids eating it because of her dietary restrictions. I could use nevertheless instead of but why is but the better choice here? Many people love chocolate yet don't eat it, whether for health reasons, allergies, personal beliefs, or even because their doctor advised them against it. There are plenty of reasons someone might avoid chocolate, so it's not particularly surprising that someone who loves chocolate doesn't eat it. In this case, but works perfectly fine. Using nevertheless would be excessive since there's no need to emphasize the contrast. It just doesn't add meaningful weight to the sentence. However, we'll soon explore situations where emphasizing the contrast does make sense. Here's a couple of examples, both good and bad. In the past, families often gathered for meals every evening, but nowadays, many people eat alone or on the go. The phrase in the past refers to earlier times, while nowadays refers to the present. Naturally, people expect changes in habits and lifestyles over time. It's no surprise that traditions evolve. So, using nevertheless here wouldn't make much sense, because no one anticipated that family mealtime patterns would remain unchanged. Change is expected, so emphasizing the contrast is not necessary or impactful. But now, look at the next example. These days, most households own multiple devices like smartphones and tablets. Nevertheless, many families still struggle to stay connected. Nowadays, technology provides countless ways to communicate instantly, which sets up an expectation that families should feel more connected than ever. However, the reality is different. Many still report feeling distant from one another despite having access to all these tools. Here, I'm emphasizing the contrast. They can connect easily, but they feel disconnected anyway. In spoken English, I could stress certain words to highlight this emphasis, but in written English, word choice has to do the work for me. In this case, nevertheless is a strong and effective choice. While however or but could also work, they feel weaker because they create a more balanced contrast, rather than underscoring the unexpected nature of the situation. There's a clear expectation being set up, only to be deliberately countered. Alright, I'll provide more examples. As I mentioned earlier, the choice of contrast word often depends on what comes next in the sentence or paragraph. Let's explore that idea further. Research shows that social media platforms were designed to foster connection, but many users report feeling isolated after spending hours online. With billions of users worldwide, these platforms promise to bring people closer together. Fill in the blank. In this case, I could use either but or however, and both would work fine. However, if I'm writing in a more formal tone, I might lean toward however. The reason is that I'm not particularly focused on the platforms or their design. I'm more interested in the users and their experiences, which is why I place them second in the sentence. I'm not emphasizing the contrast because my goal is simply to provide information about the impact on users. In the second example, I used nevertheless. Using nevertheless shifts the emphasis back to the platforms or their original purpose. Then, in the next sentence, I highlight that developers are working to address these issues, bringing the focus back to what was mentioned earlier. From there, I can continue discussing the challenges of balancing connectivity with mental health concerns. Here's a tip for those looking to improve their writing. If you're unsure about structuring your sentences correctly and want to ensure a smooth connection between them, it's best to place your last point at the end of a sentence and build on it in the next. Let me show you. For instance, social media platforms were created to foster connection, despite evidence showing they often leave users feeling isolated. Now I can follow up by saying, developers are now redesigning features to prioritize meaningful interactions. Here, I'm using despite. Remember, you have a variety of tools at your disposal to experiment with sentence structure, syntax, and word placement. By doing this, I've positioned developers closer to the next mention of them, creating a stronger link between sentences. Both approaches work well, but they serve slightly different purposes. Nevertheless, emphasizes contrast and brings attention back to the earlier point, while despite allows for flexibility in placing information and creating connections across sentences. All right, these are somewhat advanced writing tips, but hopefully you've grasped the uses of these words. That's my main goal for today. One final point. I received a question in the comments section on YouTube. Someone asked me about a sentence from one of the essays I analyzed in a video where I used both but and nevertheless. They were wondering if that's acceptable. The short answer is yes, it's technically okay. Grammatically, it's correct. Is it redundant? It can be. So you need to be very careful when combining but with nevertheless or however with despite. If you're unsure, it's best to avoid it. However, if you're confident in your writing, using them together can be a stylistic choice to add emphasis. If that's your intention, go ahead and use them, but proceed with caution. Reading books on a tablet can strain your eyes, but people are increasingly relying on digital devices for reading. Using nevertheless in this context serves to remind the reader that people are aware of the eye strain, yet continue to use tablets anyway. While anyway is informal, nevertheless is a more formal way to emphasize this idea. It highlights that people know about the potential harm, but consciously choose to ignore it and proceed regardless. In other words, I'm emphasizing their awareness. I acknowledge it, concede its truth, and confirm its accuracy, but it still doesn't stop them from doing what they want. Reading books on a tablet can strain your eyes. However, despite the potential harm to their vision, people are using tablets more frequently for reading. Now, why can I combine these words? Remember, but is a conjunction, while nevertheless is an adverb. They serve different grammatical functions. So, it's possible to use both. But connects the two clauses, while nevertheless emphasizes a specific part of the first clause. Likewise, however acts as a linking adverb to connect contrasting ideas, and despite highlights the awareness of the potential danger without letting it stop their actions. Each word plays a unique role in conveying contrast and emphasis. In the last example, have you struggled to meet your fitness goals multiple times? Sarah feels discouraged but remains determined. Here, but is the conjunction joining the two clauses. Sarah feels discouraged, but she remains determined. I omitted the second she because it's unnecessary. Meanwhile, nevertheless is an adverb that simply emphasizes the verb remains determined. Remains what? Determined. All I'm doing here is adding emphasis or stress to that idea, enhancing the style of my writing. It's not incorrect. Some might view it as redundant, but I see it as a stylistic tool you can use effectively in your writing if applied properly. All right, that's all there is to it. I hope you found this explanation helpful. If you need to, watch it again. It's crucial to understand how to use these words correctly. I notice people making mistakes with them constantly, and such errors can sometimes confuse readers about what you're trying to convey. Before I wrap up, I want to emphasize this. If you truly want to master these subtle distinctions between words, the best way is to read. That's the only real way to improve, by seeing these words in action repeatedly. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you'll be alerted when I post a new video. I'll see you again soon, hopefully with another practical and informative video. Until then, take care. Bye for now.